Coming up next on Triangulation, Joseph Menn, author and writer for Reuters. He has a new book all about the cult of the dead cow and how that's shaping security on today's internet. That's up next on Triangulation.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 401, recorded Friday, May 31st for June 7th, 2019. Joseph Menn, Cult of the Dead Cow. Hello, welcome to Triangulation. This is the show where we sit down with some people who are, well, in this case, writing about some really interesting technology topics. Each and every time I'm on, I am just honored to be here. I'm Jason Howell because I get to talk to really smart people writing really cool things about, especially is the case today, about aspects of technology that I've been obsessed is probably the wrong word, but definitely at one point in my life, I was very incredibly aware of the cult of the dead cow. And so that's why we have joining us Joseph Menn. He's the author of the new book, Cult of the Dead Cow, How the Original Hacking Supergroup Might Just Save the World. There you go. Awesome cover, by the way. How are you doing, Joseph?
I'm great, thanks.
It is
feels really good to have the book out after about 3 years of work.
I can only imagine. You've also written a couple of other books, Fatal System Error, also All the Rave. That's about Napster. I have not read All the Rave, and I need to because I also have a history with Napster, as most of us do, who were around the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s. But I mean, first of all, let me just say, this book is fascinating. Especially from the perspective of just the sheer amount of information and there's so many characters. Like I'm amazed that you, like, from your perspective, like 3 years, that seems like a long time. I understand why it took that long, because this seems like a really complicated, complex story to tell. Would you agree?
I think it was very complex, yeah. And the trick was sort of distilling it to the essence. I mean, there was a lot. You could write 3 or 4 different books about the cult of the dead cow.
Absolutely.
Just the sheer like countercultural force that it was. You could do a deep analysis of all the text files that they started out with. But I was trying to focus on, I had a number of audiences in mind, but one of them was the youngins, the people in their 20s now, who, cybersecurity now is a legit field, and there are plenty of like clean kids that go to a nice high school, go to a nice college, and then go work for a nice company in cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And they don't have the rough and tumble and the legends of the old days. And it's important. I think it's really important now, as the morality of it has gotten complicated, and the geopolitics and all the big companies tied up in security. It's so fundamental to everything. And what I really wanted to do was boil it down to give them the most important lessons of the last 35 years. And the way to do that is to pick the most interesting people who had to make all these tricky calls and sometimes argued with each other about them. But came out in various places at key moments in the development of security in the internet. And give it to the youngins on a platter. So it's not suffering to learn about it, so it's fun to learn about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely understand what you mean as far as that's concerned. I think in the realm of security, it's very easy for it to be very faceless. And I mean, all of this mysterious stuff happens behind the scenes. Who's actually, working in security, who's also working to make systems insecure. That's very faceless. Of course, they don't want people to know. The cult of the dead cow, of course, was for, decades faceless as well. Like you had their nicknames, you had their handles, but you didn't really know who these people were. And now, of course, we're starting to kind of understand a little bit more that, wait a minute, these aren't just mysterious people writing funny text files from back then. These are people who are setting the stage for the internet and online security and technology as we know it right now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so some of the people had already been outed one time or another. The New York Times outed Josh Bookbinder as the author of Back Orifice. Mudge. People know who Mudge was, and some of the others. But I got everybody else. I got by their slow convincing. I think enough time has passed, and they were willing to come forward. So I got 16 people to out themselves for the first time for the book. Nobody against their will, which was nice. And props to all of them for doing that. I think in particular Beto O'Rourke, who had a lot to lose, and I really like the fact that the other guys decided to like march forward with him and say, "Yep, us too." And some of them, a lot of them, their families didn't know, their own families.
Wow.
In most cases, their coworkers didn't know, and it's really, I think it's hard for them now. Though there's a number that I outed already in the excerpt that ran in Reuters, which is where I worked during the day. Kevin Wheeler had been just Grandmaster Rattay for 35 years, and now people know his name. And he's actually a shy person, so it's when he's not on stage in Rabbit Fur Chaps rapping. I think it's been an adjustment for all of them.
And did you pick up on a sense of pride from them as they are willing to kind of attach their name to this thing that's been so incredibly influential for a few decades now? Are they proud of, for the most part, of what they've done with CDC and where this is all led?
Absolutely, and they should be. There's also some embarrassment at individual text files they wrote when they were 15. The first thing that Beto said publicly after my story broke was that he was embarrassed for some of the stuff he wrote back then. I wouldn't be. I hope nobody ever finds what I wrote when I was 15. But I'm sure I wouldn't be proud of it. But other than that, I think they did complicated, important work that a lot more than people realize has been built on top of. I think their influence, both what they did, large, in part in the group, in part outside of the group, in government, in nonprofits, in private companies, and then the influence they've had on others. I think so much important work that's happening now in a variety of fields is by people who directly worked for these guys, this pretty small group of guys and one woman. Most people don't know that. Even, one of I think the marks of success in the book is that there was news in it, even for people in the group. That's when you know that you've really accomplished something.
Absolutely. And there were so many, over the years, there've been so many people involved with this group. Most of them inside the group, from what I've read from the book and elsewhere, a lot of them just didn't even really know each other. Didn't know each other's names outside of their the handles that they wrote under. Probably more particularly in later years. I understand that the earlier group, they were a very close knit group from early on. They kind of pioneered the idea of a HackerCon with HoHoCon, right?
That's right. So HoHoCon wasn't the first HackerCon, but it was the first one that invited the cops and the press. And hey, we're going to get offense, defense, other experts together, and we're going to have. It's not just going to be a drinking fest, though there was plenty of drinking.
Right.
It's kind of serious. When we're going to learn from each other, and that was really cool. That was Jesse Dryden's idea. Son of the drummer of the Jefferson Airplane, Spencer Dryden. And I think another thing that's cool about his role is, first of all, he was an awesome social engineer. People didn't realize how awesome, even in the group, until much later when he kind of vanished and some of the stories didn't hold up. But he also was one of the links to the 60s counterculture, because the Jefferson Airplane lived in the same house as the Grateful Dead at times in San Francisco. And there was a lot of both early tech adoption and, of course, countercultural, anti-establishment, vibe. And that's something, even though these guys, CDC was super early, we think of them as like super early hacking group. They were very conscious of history. They learned from the Blue Boxers and John Perry Barlow and all these people and the Yippies. They had an honest to God, yippee blue boxer in their midst, who was a member of the group, who's now deceased. But they learned from him, and he was like one of their original, like the grand old men that they learned from. And so that, it was really fascinating to trace the sort of the history of these ideas. It's not just the people; it's the ideas. It's a countercultural history.
Yeah, yeah, and so much of the early history. And kind of the foundation upon people actually were aware of the cult of the dead cow early on. It was certainly the foundation that I was aware of them. Back in the 80s, I had a Commodore 64. I was minorly involved in some of the stuff that they were involved with the phreaking and stuff like that until I got into trouble. But through that, I was very aware of the work of CDC and the T-files, which were... I felt like everywhere I went online, if I went to a bulletin board system, like these files were being shared and shared, which made me aware of the fact that the CDC existed. I wasn't quite sure exactly what they were, but I knew they were everywhere where I wanted to be. And so that made me more excited to kind of, read their T-files. Why T-files? Why was that the foundation for what they were doing and yet at the same time being known as a hacker group, but yet they're writing writing these text files instead of like truly hacking systems and doing something beyond that. Why T-files?
So in the beginning, in the olden days, their modems were crap. And so 300 baud for many of them. And so, you couldn't process images. That's why you had the ASCII art. It would tie up your modem all night just trying to get one picture downloaded. Yeah. So, forget video. There are no pictures. And it was always synchronous, right? A lot of these bulletin boards, only one person could connect at a time. So, you could post on a given topic and then you logged off and then somebody else could log on and read what you wrote or download a file very, very slowly if you didn't mind tying up your phone line. All night. So text files, sort of by coincidence, or by necessity, was the coin of the realm. And the cooler the text file or T file, the more sort of attention you got. I think one of the things that's unusual, especially in retrospect, about the group, is that it was underground marketing. Kevin Wheeler, majored in marketing. And they were savvy early on about how to get stuff out in front of as many people as possible. One of the interesting things about the group is that it lived through many different eras, and it had kind of a leadership role in many different eras. And people who first discovered the CDC because their text files were so widely distributed thought of them as a text file group, and that's what they were for quite a while. That's also why they survived when the other hacking groups got rounded up and arrested. There were some people in the CDC who were doing criminal things, but it was not the point of the group. And some of the others, a Legion of Doom, various branches of Legion of Doom, were basically a bunch of hackers, and they had a bulletin board where they hung out. And then they got arrested, and the CDC looked over there and said, "Okay, let's not do that. Let's stay basically a social club, a network of bulletin boards, and some of you can do hacking on your own time, and some won't. But we're not. That's not the point of the group. It's like the liberal arts wing of the hacker underground, basically. Right. So that enabled them to survive, and because they survived into the web era, when almost all the bulletin boards got wiped out, they had substantial overlap with the Loft in Boston, pioneering hackerspace. There were 4 members of the Loft that were also in CDC. And the Loft, of course, had one of the first websites, and so they preserved the CDC site. They just ported the CDC text files onto a website. So that sort of was like midwife to the next era. And then when people were just discovering the web, the media was discovering the web, and they would look like, the Loft seems to know about this web thing. What's on the Loft's website? The CDC, were already sort of like prophets because they were ahead of the curve. And so they became very popular, again, in sort of this sort of cultural way. And it was only around then that serious technical minds wanted to join, because they're like, CDC were the cool kids. So they didn't start out with these sort of hacker geniuses like Mudge and Dilldog, alias Chris Rue, founder of Veracode. But those people joined in that era, in the 90s, mid 90s and on, and so it became the sort of the technical elite of the kind that they used to mock back when they were teenagers and like wanted to be as cool as MOD and LOD, and so wrote files making fun of them. Like now they actually became the thing that they'd been making fun of.
Yeah, no kidding. And as their progression years and decades later, they became into those roles of power that they were potentially pushing against. Beto O'Rourke could be a prime example of that, but at the same time, that might inspire a fresh outlook. And we can definitely talk about Beto a little bit later in the show, because I definitely have some questions about his involvement. But the Loft is very interesting to me. The idea that the CDC and the Loft, they were kind of operating independent of each other, but they had a very kind of mutually beneficial coexistence, right? And they kind of through the Loft developed these tools like back orifice, and this was all kind of in combination. I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how does that relationship between those two entities exist and foster itself over the course of the years?
Well, I think it's a great story, and it illustrates like what it's like in the formative days of such an important industry. And the rules are sort of being made up as you go. So like pretty much everybody who was any good started out breaking the law. I mean, you stole long distance service, right, because otherwise your parents are going to have a $500 phone bill, and that's not going to go over well. Right. So, then gradually, as private companies where security is really important, the only guys who know anything have done at least a little criminal stuff, but you want to hire them. And it's really complicated, and it's complicated at a very individual level. So there's so many people like the CDC now who are CTOs and CSOs at major companies, and like there are 30 old friends that could burn them. Say, I know that you used to do this, and it's like this like the secret society, and they're almost all good guys and women, but the Loft and CDC is, the shorthand is it was good cop, bad cop. All right. So the Loft issued these public advisories, and people like Microsoft thought that they were bad, thought the Loft was bad. They shouldn't be telling people that there's a flaw and that they had better patch. And so initially the vendors, objected to what the Loft was doing, but the Loft kept at it, and gradually they sort of won like public opinion, because the buyers of the software said, like, look, I wouldn't have known that hackers could break into my stuff were it not for what the Loft was saying. And they're releasing Loft Crack and other tools that hackers can use. But I need those tools. I need to know whether the passwords that my employees are using are easily broken or not. So there are a lot of close moral calls here. But the Loft eventually won the day. But CDC was a little edgier. So the Loft wanted to be able to go and testify before Congress, as they famously did in 1998. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be able to deal with the National Security Council, as they did through Richard Clarke. They wanted to get big deals with Microsoft or others. So they couldn't get too edgy. Cult the Dead Cow. They're wearing masks. They're at DEF CON. They're wearing rabbit fur chaps. In the case of Kevin Wheeler, they're rapping. They're hyping up the hackers. That's your crazy cousin from Texas. Mm-hmm. That's the bad cop. And if you don't deal with the Loft, you don't take them seriously, then you're going to have to answer to your cousin from Texas. And that's why Back Orifice and BO2K had to come out through CDC. As Mudge told me, even BO2K, which was like fairly classy piece of software, but a Trojan that would allow anybody, even a script kiddie, to take over somebody else's machine. It already had the stank of the Cult of the Dead Cow on it, because Back Orifice came out that way. So even though Chris Rue, the lead author of BO2K, was a member of the Loft couldn't be associated with it. That was from the Crazy Cousins for Texas. That's who had to be had their names on that one.
Why didn't Microsoft take this seriously? It really seemed like, reading through that part of the book about back-orifice, the first back-orifice release, Microsoft could not care. It really seemed like, or if they did, they were doing nothing, to raise the attention or the awareness of their users, and ultimately, to the users' detriment. Like, why do you think Microsoft wouldn't rise up to that challenge and address it firsthand?
So this is I think just completely fascinating, and there's quieter echoes of it today. Somebody will expose a security flaw, and the company will downplay it. I mean, it's sort of a natural tendency.
Yep.
Back then, the stakes were much bigger, and Microsoft didn't have that many people dedicated to security. There was nobody to sort of pull the emergency brake on the train car when a new OS was shipping, solely because of a security concern. I mean, it could happen, but nobody had responsibility for just the security of a new OS. They had a lot of people in marketing, and they had a lot of people in sales, and it was very hard. And they knew that, I mean, it was so new that, consumers were still not buying based on security. And frankly, they couldn't, because there was really only one OS. Mm-hmm. So monopoly power, oligopoly power, the lack of legal liability for crap software, those were all sort of systemic problems. And one of the things I admire most about the people in the cult of the dead cow is that when they became, they're not only fighting a monopoly, in the case of Microsoft, a court-certified monopoly, but this sort of entrenched economic system that makes it almost impossible to make movement. They just found a workaround. They're hackers, but they were hackers in the broadest possible sense. We're going to hack society if we need to. We're going to hack the media. We're going to figure out a way to make things better. And it turned out with Microsoft, the way to do that was to have a media circus. The embarrassment was what moved Microsoft off the dime finally. And you're right. It was, to their surprise, even despite the front page coverage, Microsoft was still downplaying. It was like, this isn't a big deal, because the initial port that it was connecting to was 1337. So all he had to do, was have an AV that blocked 1337, which is, leet. Right?
Yeah. That's great.
And
Not
then,
subtle at all. No.
And then still, I mean, the public was oblivious. They didn't get right. It's all inside baseball, right?
Yeah.
So they were like, well, this is no big deal. We'll just block it, and then there's nothing to worry about. And the CDC was incensed. Even those inside who'd been a little leery of putting these hacker tools in the hands of kiddies were like, wow, Microsoft's still going to blow this off? Like, okay, let's double down. And so, BO2K is much more sophisticated, and it was open source. So that meant that anybody with any real talent could tweak it, and they would be able to get by AV. So that was that really forced Microsoft to take it more seriously after that.
And some of the antivirus makers were contacting, of course, the Loft to say, hey, can you give us, can we pay you to have access so that when this releases, we can be blocking it? Which I imagine they kind of thought was a hilarious question to begin with. But I think what really struck me about this, your chapter that talks about back orifice, kind of goes back to a point you made earlier about their savviness with the media and understanding to a deep level the right strings to pull, the right strategy in order to gain maximum impact. We've got to have them allied with this point of view, them against that point of view. And if we, reveal too much too early, then the story will go nowhere, or it'll paint us in a different, different perspective. This is what we need to do. And I mean, for the most part, it really worked. They were incredibly media savvy. And I think a lot of people, companies nowadays could learn a lot from their strategies. Would you agree?
I would agree. And, this is, we all have strengths and weaknesses. I'm sort of used to covering, tech. I'm used to covering security and hackers. I've done it for 20 years. I don't really write about marketing. I tend to think of those guys as the enemy. They're the ones that are trying to manipulate stuff, occasionally put out stuff that is outright false. And so I had to set that aside and like, well, okay, let's look at like the marketing skills of these guys, and they're really good. And some of their stuff was complete BS, but it often had the effect that they wanted.
Yeah.
So I had to set aside my own like moral problems with this stuff and admire it because they did the job, and they put out slick press packets. And they explained their stuff, and you kind of had to root for them because it was David versus Goliath, right? I mean, I don't know how many people Microsoft had in marketing and PR, but a lot. And the CDC would get in arguments with them, and they're so smart, not just technically, but in terms of communications, that if you're really paying attention, you're like, well, actually the CDC is right. I mean, maybe they're scruffy criminals, that are hiding behind pseudonyms, but they got a point.
Yeah, there's something behind it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Maybe as far as like the broader sense, these are not the only two tools that they created. They created a number of tools over the years. What was their ultimate reason for doing so? Disclosure to these companies that are building systems or applications or whatever the case may be that are insecure. Was that always their number one goal? Responsible disclosure, all that.
So that was absolutely the major goal. But it was bigger than that. They wanted to make security better, and they did sort of the hard, sort of critical moral reasoning, and figured out that the way to make security better is to blow the whistle on stuff. And so they were pioneers of responsible disclosure. I mean, the Loft in particular, the guys at the Loft, sort of established the standard that still exists today, where you work with the vendor, you give them a reasonable amount of time, and then you dump it on the public. And that's, there's pluses and minuses to all these things, but that's what works the best so far. So they did that, but things still weren't getting done enough. There's still crappy software. There are bigger problems. And to me, it's like incredible how they kept leveling up.
Yeah.
So after sort of the heyday of, the group as CDC, they went off in different directions and did different things. It seemed like an impossible task, really. And they found like 3 different ways of making software and security better for everybody. So briefly, I would say Mudge led the wing that went off to work for the government. So he did other things first, but then he works for BBN, some of the folks that brought you the internet as a government contractor back in the day, as an executive running their work for the intelligence agencies and cybersecurity, and then he goes to DARPA and is the head of grant making for both offense and defense in cybersecurity about 8 years or so ago. So we're around the Stuxnet time, in there, general ballpark, when they were doing really innovative stuff that mostly is still classified. So that's what he did. And then he's done other stuff since. He did special projects for Google, and he came up with a lab. It's like Consumer Reports for helping companies evaluate the security of software that they buy without access to the source code. So that's one wing, incredibly important work. Then there's the at-stake wing. Okay, so during the dot-com boom, the Loft turns into at-stake. That's Dildog, Mudge, and others. Dildog is Chris Rue. And it's the first big security boutique where the hackers will come in to Microsoft or big banks or whomever and tell them how to fix stuff, how to make it better. So they had a terrific impact from the inside. And then Chris Rue goes off and co-founds Veracode with Chris Weisopel, who had been in the Loft. And Veracode, similar to what Mudge would do later, is a system for analyzing code from the binaries and figuring out what it's actually doing, as opposed to what the source code or third-party reviews of source code says it's supposed to do. Really changes the balance of power to the software buyer, so they can see how secure stuff is and they can demand, improvements. That was really, really important. And then this other completely different third branch is the hacktivism branch, where you have people that are much more political. And Oxblood Ruffin is the key figure here. That's the handle. His real name's Laird Brown. And they have tremendous influence, which people don't realize today, on the development of Tor and the very founding of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, which, for my money, is the paragon of sort of non-biased, human rights-oriented work on exposing software being used for evil, for government surveillance of citizens and for attacks on hacktivists. Everything you've read about NSO, this Israeli spyware vendor, about their gear being used to spy on Mexican dissidents and journalists and politicians, and against Khashoggi's, the slain journalists from Saudi Arabia, his associates, is most of what you read about that is because of the Citizen Lab in the University of Toronto. And the Citizen Lab was founded because of Ron Deibert, the guy behind its conversations with Oxblood Ruffin. So the impact of this group is almost impossible to overstate. And that's before you get to Beto O'Rourke.
Right. Yeah. Right. Almost impossible to overstate, and very challenging to write about. I have to imagine keeping all of these paths straight and everything must have been a huge challenge. Obviously you've named a number of notable people who were either directly or tangentially involved. John Stamos, John Perry Barlow was a big influence. Jesse Dryden, of course, Beto O'Rourke. Are you, at this point, we don't know the identity of all of the people that have been involved with the CDC, but do you have a feeling that there's more people hiding within those ranks, like those names, like Beto O'Rourke is one example, people who are in their own right kind of famous in their own life, but we just don't realize that they were actually involved with this?
So there are some people who have done edgy and important things, and there's some people who are sort of more creative types that aren't household names. There aren't. But I got all the biggies. I mean, there are no other Beto O'Rourkes. Right. There are no other Mudges. There are people that are doing cool things, but I got all the really important core members of the group who had not previously been outed came out in the book.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I was interested in was this idea of this transition from the bulletin boards into the internet, which was not an easy transition for a number of different groups. Yet CDC was able to pull this off. They were able to survive this transition from BBSs into the internet. How do you think they were able to do that so gracefully? And I mean, even now today, they still exist. They have a web presence. You can find them online. They're still very, still active in their own right. But how did they survive this?
Well, again, it was kind of their path was through the Loft, because the Loft was very early on the web, and there was overlap, and they liked the CDC. They had a midwife to the next medium, and then because of that, they got this media attention, and then there was a sort of a key moment where they had this media attention, and they had to figure out what to do with it. So the first order of business was making Windows safer. But after that, they were still sort of, okay, there's a guy, Jason Scott Sadowski, proprietor of textfiles.com and sort of a historian of the bulletin board era, now working for the Internet Archive. He says, like the dog that caught the car and then just decided to get in and drive it to see where it went. So again, one of the big shifts there was Oxblood Ruffin, who was an outsider. He wasn't even an American. He was a Canadian. He wasn't particularly deep in technology, but he saw the sort of potential for this new movement. And he was very human rights focused, having worked in the bowels of the UN. And so he started haranguing members of the CDC in their own language and sort of flattering them, but cajoling them and sort of pushing them to be more political. And he picked the perfect foil, which was the government of China. You know, the CDC is a big tent, right? There are people who wind up working for the government. There are people who have no problem with civil disobedience. But nobody likes the government of China. And so he convinced them to, you know, look at the suppression of the free flow of information that the Chinese government was orchestrating, and said, okay, why don't you try to build stuff that helps people in China get around the censorship? And pretty much everybody agreed that would be a good thing. So he worked on some open source stuff that were CDC projects. They didn't take off in themselves, but they did prompt Tor to add a browser, which was a pretty big deal, and take other steps. So they sort of pushed that along. So I think that was a very key transition. And as we've already spoken about, you know, hacktivism went on to do other things. And then, you know, the at stake wing, you know, there are a lot of amazing people that went to work for at stake, because like there were younger people that saw these are the guys that testified before Congress, and now they have their own company. Like, what a cool thing, you know, what a cool place to go work. So people that went to work there include Alex Stamos, who was then like a young Berkeley graduate, who went on to be chief security officer at Yahoo and then Facebook. Window Snyder, who went on to spearhead. She went in-house at Microsoft and was the brains behind Windows XP Service Pack 2, which sounds like a bunch of letters and numbers if you're really young, but was a big deal. Was a major leap forward in security for Microsoft. And then she went inside Apple and convinced the company that it had to treat itself as part of the threat model against its customers, which was a crazy idea until Snowden came along. And then people realized that wasn't crazy, that, you know, the government could force companies to rat out their customers. And it put Apple in a position to tell the FBI to get lost when the FBI wanted it to hack the iPhone of a San Bernardino terrorist. So, I mean, you can disagree whether that was the right call or not, but it wouldn't have been possible without the preparation of Window Snyder and other sort of CDC fellow travelers who were pushing Apple to take security that seriously.
Yeah, no kidding. So hacktivism, obviously CDC coined that term, which is a term that's very familiar to this day. What is the purpose, though, of hacktivismo? The difference between the hacktivism, the term, and hacktivismo, which is more like a kind of an organized effort.
So there were a couple of offshoots of CDC, and that's because, you know, CDC itself was like small and elite, and it was supposed to stay that way. They only ever had about 20 active members at a time. The whole course of the thing, the 35 years or so, there's only been about 50 members of the CDC, though you will find hundreds who claim that they're in the CDC.
Right.
But they're nice guys, and they didn't want to be like exclusive and obnoxious. So there were a number of offshoots, and one was the Ninja Strike Force, which started out as basically their friends. Friends that they liked, that they respected, and they said, okay, you're in the CDC Ninja Strike Force. And that thing grew and grew. And there are hundreds and hundreds of people in the Ninja Strike Force. Some of them great people who did great stuff, and some of them less great. It kind of got out of control. And the other key spinoff was Hacktivismo. And so this was Oxblood's baby. And the entire point of it was hacktivism. Mm-hmm. And that was the sort of the umbrella for these, a number of privacy protecting browsers and other efforts to keep people safe and secure and allow them to communicate anonymously. And as I said, was a spur for other things. Yeah. So it's interesting, though, that the Hacktivismo group included also some people that hadn't been thoroughly vetted. And one of them wrote the spyware that became the basis of Gamma Group, which is one of the major spyware vendors to Western and other government agencies. So the CDC is so influential that it's not all good. There were they also spurred some bad stuff. And they wind up being on both sides of a surprising number of issues. One of them is this Gamma Group thing. So hacktivism, as defined by Oxblood, was hacking and security work in service of human rights. Other people took up the mantle and decided that hacktivism was something else. So Anonymous launched a lot of denial of service attacks against folks that stopped processing payments to WikiLeaks, for example. Some in CDC thought that denial of service attacks were defensible, and some said, no, that's censorship, that's bad. Oxblood would be among those. But the most celebrated recent hacktivism incidents include the hacking of these spyware vendors. Gamma Group got creamed by hackers who said they were doing it for a moral purpose because the spyware is being sold to repressive regimes. Hacking team in Italy also hacked by hacktivists, ostensibly the same hacktivists, and then a whole bunch of other spyware vendors that have been hacked and their wares have been dumped. Some of these, I think, it's about morality, and they disapprove of what these folks are doing. I make a circumstantial case in the book that some of the biggest hacks like this, including Hacking Team and Gamma Group, may have been done by the Russians. That doesn't mean that it was wrong necessarily, but intelligence agencies have been hiding under the hacktivism label almost from the beginning.
Interesting. Laird Brown, obviously, you've talked a lot about his involvement, his significance. One thing that you touch on in the book is the Hong Kong Blondes. Who were the Hong Kong Blondes? And ultimately, they didn't actually exist. Am I misunderstanding this aspect? This is a little confusing to me, but talk a little bit about this.
So there are some things that I could not resolve completely in the book. It is clear that the story of the Hong Kong Blondes, which I'll spell out in a moment, is somewhere between 80% crap and 100% crap. And I don't know which it is. Mm-hmm. But what was widely reported as fact by established publications, including Wired and the Los Angeles Times, is false. And again, this is one of those icky things for me as a journalist where, I basically think the CDC, with some exceptions, are basically good guys. On the other hand, I'm glad as hell that I didn't fall for the swindle because a lot of people I respect did. Mm. So the Hong Kong Blonde story, and again, this is from Oxblood, is that there's this group of Chinese dissidents that are tech savvy, and the CDC is helping them come up with all kinds of stuff, ways to communicate, maybe sabotage, ways to fight the Chinese regime. And it was a really compelling story. And Oxblood is a great storyteller, another sort of marketing whiz. And he said that he'd met these people when he was working around the UN. And after Tiananmen Square, the massacre there, he stayed in touch with them, and he gave them this idea that they could use the net to do more activist things and stay under the radar. And I think he kind of lost control of the story. I mean, it resonated with people, and some reporters chased him and wanted more details. So he provided more details. And he said that he had met this one ringleader, Blondie Wong, in Toronto. And Blondie Wong was this mysterious figure, and he helped smuggle people out of the country, and he did all these other things. And he was either a currency trader or an astrophysicist or something else. It gets a little confusing. But he had this whole network of other people. And then Lemon Lee was another one. And they're all pseudonyms, of course. And he sort of forced the CDC to go out with this because initially they were supportive of the story. And then a reporter for Wired wanted more details, and he wanted to interview Blondie Wong. And Oxford said, well, I can't do that, security things, but, I'll interview him and I'll give you the transcript. So he did that. And then he gave the reporter for Wired this transcript, and Wired wrote this excited story about it. And then there's a guy inside CDC that wants to publish it as a text file. This is our thing. This is a CDC thing. And he asked Oxblood, this seems like kind of sometimes this guy talks like you might expect somebody from China to talk, and sometimes he seems to talk like you. Kevin Wheeler made the same point. And so Oxford said, well, okay, well, I made up some of it, for security reasons. And they're like, but it was sort of too late. They sort of had to publish it because, this is going to be one of the great text files, and you've given it to Wired and you haven't published it yourself. That's weird. So they published it. They, by and large, got away with it. Some people are like, some press looked at it and like, wow, there's only one source. We have Oxblood Ruffin, who is a pseudonym, talking to this other guy who is a pseudonym, and that's all there is. There is no way to independently check any of this. But, also this is 99, 00, 01, and some people ran with it. And it got widespread. One of the fascinating things to me is that there's a chain of events that start with the Hong Kong Blonde story, which is largely or entirely fiction, that winds up helping a lot of people. And if you'll indulge me, the chain is something like there's a guy helping Tibetans in Dharamsala, India, who reads the Hong Kong Blonde story and says, wow, this is awesome, and believes it. There is this group of Chinese dissidents, and there are these American hackers that are helping them. We have to get them in touch. We have to have them come here and help us. So he gets in touch with Oxblood, convinces Oxblood to come to India and help the Tibetans in exile from China who are under constant cyber attacks from China. So Oxblood goes to India and does good for a while. And then later he introduces the guys in India to the people at the Citizen Lab. And the Citizen Lab is getting geared up and getting better at analyzing, surveillance and other attacks. And Oxblood's contacts in India wind up giving the raw material to the Citizen Lab that provide the foundation for the GhostNet report, which is the first public expose of an advanced persistent threat. And it was China, because China was using the same techniques against the Tibetans that it was against embassies around the world. And so this big report comes out in 09 or 10 and, really opens people's eyes to how sophisticated and pervasive Chinese spying is around the world. And it's because of this made up story from 10 years earlier. It's just amazing.
Wow. And again, speaks to the power of their ability or their awareness around how to manipulate the media. They're really good at it, whether they're telling the truth or not. The media wants to believe, apparently, in that regard. So we talked a little bit about Beto O'Rourke earlier. I thought we could kind of wind around to this near the end of the interview, only because it kind of seems like this became a really big story near the end of the production phase of your book. In essence, this really this became big news in the last couple of months, and your book is only now coming out. And of course, Beto O'Rourke is now running for president, for the presidency of the U.S. So how did you come across this information? I'm fascinated to know how easily this was discovered and kind of the machinations behind the scenes as far as that's concerned.
Yeah. Can you believe we've got somebody who's not just a hacker, but somebody who's in the cult of the dead cow running for president?
It's like pretty awesome, actually. It's interesting.
It's like the future showed up in a hurry.
It really did.
So I was trying to, pick a book topic that was more positive than than something called Fatal System Error, my previous book. So Fatal System Error was like the first book that sold a bunch of copies that said we're all screwed. And it's because of geopolitics and the indefensibility of the attack surface on the internet, and because of software liability or lack thereof and other issues. But I made it dramatic. I had some Russian bad guys who actually get caught and go to jail, and it's a big spy story or whatever. So lots of other people since then have done books about why we're screwed in this way, we're screwed in that way, But there's been very, very little that says, hey, here's something we can do to make things better. And so I was looking for that. And I hit upon the CDC because of all the amazing work that they did directly and those that were influenced by them did. But as I was fleshing it out, I was talking to the members to do, a proposal to write a book on this. And they were, we're hashing through their claims to fame and stuff that's already out there about them and stuff that isn't known about them. And they said, you know, hey, we've got a congressman. I don't think he'll talk to you, but we got a congressman. That's impressive. Maybe he'll talk to me, maybe he won't. But that's something I can explain that will be a part of the book. Even if I'm never able to convince him, it will be an interesting part of the book. So that's where I was when I got the book deal and I started working on the book. I still didn't know who the person was or if they would talk to me. And then, but once I'm like really worked on the book in earnest, of course, that's one of my, the questions I'm going to try and resolve. Who is
Absolutely.
it? And I start to see these stories about a guy running for Senate who was in Congress or is in Congress, who is from Texas, who was in a punk rock band, and, which some of the other members were, punk or rap. There were a lot of seriously musically inclined people in the group. And it was perhaps most importantly is this magic age. There's like this 3-year bubble between when War Games came out and people realized that they could dial anywhere on the internet, the early internet, and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, which made it criminal. There was this magic era, and if you came of age in that era, those 3 years, then you were part of this influential thing. It was like this mini like a baby boom sort of a phenomenon, and he was in that age. He was 11, 12, or 13 in there, as were many of the others in the CDC. And so it just circumstantially fit, and so that was my guess. And I ran it by some of my best sources in CDC. And they wouldn't say yes, but they wouldn't say no either. They said, we're not going to talk about this. And I'm like, oh, okay, I think it's him. And eventually I said, well, look, they started asking me, when is your book coming out? And I said, oh, not until, 2019. And they're like, well, if you don't print anything until after November, then we can probably help you. And so, I wasn't trying to get a scoop like right now. I'm trying to write a history of security on the internet and like a guidebook for the future of security on the internet and all these things. And so I said, well, I'm not going to get this any other way. I haven't been able to get it in months. So, okay, I agreed to this embargo. And I said, okay, yeah, it's Beto O'Rourke.
Wow.
And then more incredibly, when I met Beto O'Rourke, I laid out the same thing. Look, this is not going to come out until after the November election. And I think he was thinking, we haven't talked about this explicitly, but I think he was thinking, look, he's either going to win the Senate race and have 6 years to live this down, or he's going to be out of politics for a while. And it's not going to matter so much. So he said, yeah, sure. And he gave me a terrific interview about what CDC meant to him. And I think there are some things that made it easier for him to be the first, really super establishment guy to admit to this kind of a background. Well, unless you count Steve Jobs, and Steve Wozniak, but the first guy where people can vote on whether you're a good guy or not to do this. I think first of all, he'd already copped to being arrested for DUI and for trespassing in his misspent youth. So it's not how much worse is it that he stole long distance service, and then I think it's that he moved on from there and into technology. He ran a tech business in Texas, and then also I think there wasn't anything in what he did then that makes him look like a hypocrite. It's not like you're like a fundamentalist who got caught in bed with a hooker. It's like back then he was for legalization of drugs. And he thought that Nazis were bad. He did one of the more interesting text files he did was a Q&A with a neo-Nazi, and he was exposing the guy as an idiot. And lo and behold, here he is in politics, and he's in favor of legalizing marijuana. He thinks that technology is really important, and that we should bring outside thinkers into the fold whenever possible. And he thinks Nazis are bad. He's the same guy. And I think that was one of the reasons he was willing to talk about it.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. I love it. But also surprising, because when you consider the hyper aware point that we are at right now in the world of politics, everyone on both sides is always looking for that one thing, that like critical hit to say like, oh, well, you've got this in your background and therefore you are no good, 100% you're out. For him to have this history and yet still be able to navigate through it the way he has, at least so far. I don't know. Do you think that, you know, as he continues further down this road towards a possible nomination for presidency, that this might become a bigger issue for him?
It's hard for me to imagine that the hacker background is not going to come up again in the campaign. There's obviously more detail in the book, and there's plenty more about CDC in the book than in the article I had to let go early. And I should explain why I had to let that article go early. So my deal with the members of CDC, including Beto, is that the story would not run until after the November election. And I thought the November, you know, we delayed publication of the book a little bit so I could make sure, you know, I wanted to have the third act. Does the guy win? You know, do we have a CDC member in the United States Senate or not? And then, you know, he didn't win. So I was like, okay, well, so that's the last paragraph, and maybe we'll get something about, you know, what his plans are. And then, you know, trundling along on the book, and then, you know, he's not going away. He's like doing these like, you know, touring the you know, a number of states by car to, like, you know, talk to voters. I'm like, oh my gosh, he might be running for president. And so I'm tracking this quite closely. And, you know, so are the folks at the publishing house. And then when it looks like it really is running for president, I'm like, okay, we're going to have to report this, because for a number of reasons. One is my deal with him is up, and people need to know that a presidential candidate had this kind of interesting background, you know, pluses and minuses. That's the biggest reason. And the other, you know, frankly, too many people knew, because it's great. Not everybody in CDC knew. Some very major people in CDC, you know, Beto had punched out before they joined, so they didn't know. But, you know, it's great gossip. And so I was sort of constantly monitoring how many people knew, and it was a lot. It was dozens of people, and you know, I couldn't get beat on my own scoop. It was very hard to sit on it as long as I did for the book, and I wasn't going to get beat on it. So after he declared, I let him have, like, you know, a clear day after he declared for president, where everybody got their news stories out about, you know, his background, and I'm like, oh, and this. And that story, which we'd put a lot of care into, and, you know, graphics and videos and all the stuff that I'm not good at. And that was the most on Reuters.com that had more interaction than any story that Reuters.com had ever published. Wow. And so it was huge. And the right immediately pounced and said, oh my God, he broke the law. He wrote some embarrassing teenage stuff, and Beto said, I'm embarrassed about some of the stuff that I wrote. And there hasn't been much since. Like, Beto, you know, sort of hinted that, you know, hey, you know, hackers are actually sort of useful people, and I'm waiting for more of that. I think that would be a very interesting thing to bring out into the open, and we'll see if it happens. You know, I think there's a good chance that the right, or his primary opponents, will point out some of the stuff, and he'll give, now that the book is out and people see the context, that he'll give a more full-throated defense. We'll see.
Yeah. And that right there, you said hackers are very useful people, is, you know, by and large, to a very large degree, kind of a big, short, concise summary of the story of CDC, really. You know, that these are at their core, they are hackers, and we are used to looking at hackers through a very particular lens. But hey, check it out. They've literally, this group in many ways has shaped what we arguably take for granted, you know, as far as security on the internet and political awareness and a whole bunch of other facets. Who the heck would have known when I was on my Commodore 64 reading, you know, those T files, what it would lead to down the line. And that's why it's a fascinating story. And I'm so happy that you took the time and the energy to write this. Joseph Menn is the author of Cult of the Dead Cow, How the Original Hacking Supergroup Might Just Save the World. And it's a phenomenal read. I really got so much from it, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me about it today, Joseph.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Best of luck, and yeah, I'll be keeping my eyes peeled to kind of the projection of Beto O'Rourke and to see kind of where that leads as well. And I have to imagine that'll be good for book sales. So congratulations.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joseph. We do this show every single week, every Friday, 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific. You can catch it live if you like, twit.tv/live. We do most of them live, but most people go to twit.tv/TRI or twit.tv/triangulation. There you're going to find all of the previous episodes of this show, and if you go there, you're going to find a lot of fascinating interviews. So many people that we've talked to over the years. This is the 401 interviews to date, and you've got a lot of catching up to do if you haven't checked it out yourself. I'm honored to do this show. I'm Jason Howell. Thank you for allowing me to sit down with Joseph and talk about a wonderful book. We hope you'll join us next time on Triangulation. See y'all later. Bye.